The Polypolitics show comes to you every first and third Friday of every month. Welcome to the Polypolitics podcast. I'm your host, Christopher Turner, where opinions are challenged and facts matter. A place for honest conversations and unfiltered perspectives. My guest today is Clifford Brown, a former Foreign Service officer who spent 27 years working with the USAID, including serving as a mission director to Guinea and Sierra Leone. He's also the author of Inside USAID, an Odyssey of Foreign Assistance, which examines the agency's work, its shortcomings, and what the United States lost when it was dismantled. Clifford, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So you spent 27 years working with USAID. You watched the agency get dismantled. What made you write this book? What made you think that this was like the right time to write it? And what does this book really, what does it tell us?
Well, the book is actually a continuation of some stories that I had published earlier. I had been collecting these tales over several decades, basically for the sake of my kids and grandkids. And the first book was called Dilettante. I chose that name because I was able to dabble in literally thousands of different subjects in USAID, and I can get into later why that was the case. USAID was the tool that the U.S. government used to basically do anything overseas that didn't require a military response and could not be done by pure diplomacy. We used to joke that, those guys over in the embassy, they write a lot of cables and they have a lot of meetings, but we would bring contractors and NGOs to town and actually get stuff done in thousands of different areas. That people are talking about the humanitarian programs and the health programs and whatnot, which is, it's certainly proper to lament their loss, but I was able to dabble in so many different areas. And so that's what the first book was basically telling my own story about how I got there, because I gave up a successful career. I was practicing commercial law in Beverly Hills. I was a partner in a firm there, but a big case came to an end. It was a Continental Airlines bankruptcy case, and I had represented one of the creditors committees in that case, and it was all consuming. And so for like 3 years, all I was doing is going back and forth to Houston. And when the case ended, I had my feet up on the desk. I had far less to do all of a sudden. And I saw an ad. The Wall Street Journal was advertising for the USAID wanted attorneys that had another language. And I said, well, that sounds interesting. I really didn't know what USAID was at the time, but I flew back to D.C. I went into the main state building where they were co-located with state at the time. And I interviewed with the general counsel. He had this big map on the wall with little red pins all around the world. And I asked him what the pins were. He said, that's where our attorneys are. And something in me said, I got to have that job. It was going to be too cool. And, I gave up about 2/3 of my income to join that agency. But the real issue was my wife, who gave up 100% of hers when she followed me to Nairobi a couple years later. But it was a lot of fun. And I lived through some crazy moments in a number of countries where they fell apart suddenly and unexpectedly. So last year, when it was being fed into the wood chipper, it outraged me, frankly. They were calling us crooks and saying that everybody was corrupt and we were stealing from the U.S. taxpayer. We were the opposite of crooks. Believe me, there were some very idealistic people there. We had a big component of people who were former Peace Corps volunteers that had gotten a taste of what, working overseas and helping other people is about, and they wanted to keep doing that on a bigger scale. I was quite lucky to be able to, very few attorneys get to do the kind of work that I was able to do. Of course, it was, right. Whatever I learned, it was absolutely useless outside of the agency, but for the most part. But sure. I don't regret doing it. We got to live in 7 different countries. The government put my kids through, fancy international private schools. They paid for the housing. We got all the local holidays. We got the American holidays, and we got home leave every 2 years. It was a bit of a racket. In that sense, I don't disagree with everything that was said about them, but at the same time, we were helping these other countries, and we were helping the U.S. We accomplished a lot that helped us, and I tell those stories in the book. what that. So I was outraged that they were saying that about our agency. I also saw hundreds of my close friends lose their careers, and literally tens of thousands of employees are just out on the street all of a sudden. And plus, that was perhaps the biggest tort that's ever happened in our country, and I don't know that it'll be redressed, but there are some wrongful termination actions pending now in the courts. But over 800,000 deaths are now. There's a group in Boston that's tracking the deaths that we could have prevented with our programs. And there's a better book that I want to mention. It's better than my stories because mine were written way before this event. The book's called Into the Wood Chipper. It's by a guy named Nicholas Eclair, and he was in the Global Health Bureau. He was suddenly found himself as the head of it when the Doge boys were coming in and directing him to simultaneously keep all the programs alive that saved lives, which Rubio, he issued an order saying we were going to keep those programs alive. But at the same time, they didn't do it. They were destroying the financial systems. They fired the staff that were working on those programs, and they terminated all the grants and contracts. Now, it took a long time for some of them to get reactivated, and a very few programs are now being run by the State Department by people that don't really have the background to do it. But it was a complete goat rope.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was the first thing I thought when you said that. You said it. Hey, you losing your wife's income. I was like, yeah, I wonder how happy she was about you bouncing off to Nairobi. You said they were looking for terrorists to speak another language. That you spoke. Honestly, I don't know what language they speak in Nairobi.
Well, they speak Swahili, and their official language is English. But I did learn Swahili when I was there. I had Spanish already because, and that was actually, I left this part out. I had always wanted to use my Spanish in my work. I got a fellowship right after college to travel in Latin America for a year. And I had earlier dropped out of school for a year, and I worked on an oceanographic boat that went down to the South Pacific, and then it came up the coast of South America. And when it was in Chile, I met a cousin I didn't even know I had, but our mothers knew that my ship was going to Chile, and the officers came to the ship's office and said, "Cliff, your cousin's at the gangway." And I said, "I don't have any cousins down here." "Well, he says he's your cousin, and he looks like you, and he sounds like you." So I went out there, and here was this guy. He was in the Peace Corps, and he was standing next to a beautiful Chilean woman that he later married and had 5 kids with. So 2 years later on that fellowship, I ended up going down, and I was living with her father. And he didn't speak a word of English, and his housekeeper didn't speak a word of English. So I learned Spanish well. I had studied it for 1 year in college, but that year was really what cemented it. So all the time I was practicing law in LA, well, first I'll say that when you learn a language well and you really use it, Charlemagne said this several hundred years ago, it's kind of like you've grown another soul. You literally feel like a different person when you're immersed in that language and you're using it. And I craved that experience. And I at the time, I was young enough and foolish enough to think, well, I got enough money now, I can go do something that's going to be more fun. I didn't know I was going to have 3 more kids and another wife, but that happened later. I look back for many years, wondering if I'd done the right thing. But at the same time, like I said, it was far more adventurous, and we were living like colonials. We had a lifestyle in Nairobi and everywhere we lived that was, frankly, easier than anything we could have done in LA. We had a cook and a live-in housekeeper and a driver, and we were, as I say, living like colonials.
I'm sure the dollar goes a lot further there.
Yeah. And the housing was on Uncle Sam, and we got to travel all around these countries and these areas where we live. So it was fantastic.
Well, I'm on day 13 of my Spanish journey, so I'm not going to try to speak to you and embarrass myself on the show. But yeah, no, that actually sounds really awesome. You mentioned that there's that group out of Boston that's tracking the people that could have been saved under. Sorry, I always say. Is it USAID? Is it USAID? Is it USAID? I've heard it said so many times. So many different ways. What's the actual proper way?
When I
Okay.
first joined it, they called it
Indian all.
AID,
Uh-huh.
which was a cute pun. It just, it did not mean assistance, as in foreign aid. It meant
Mhm.
Agency for International Development. So a lot of academics and even State Department people, they'll still call, and government folks, they'll call us AID. But sometime in my career, there was a USAID administrator who said, people are confusing us with like the IMF and the World Bank or
Mm.
the World Health Organization. We got to put the US in there. And ever since then, at first it was USAID, and then other people just shortened it to USAID. And so either way works. Just like you can call me
Okay.
Cliff or Clifford, you can say USAID or AID or whatever.
Okay, cool. I just want to make sure I made it messed up. But yeah, I actually saw those numbers. Actually, a friend of mine had shown me those numbers that you were talking about. That 800,000 that could have been saved under
Yeah,
USAID. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't a large majority of that children too?
for sure, for sure.
Yeah, I think it was like
And see,
five
the
hundred
thing is,
thousand of it, right?
when they were debating what Marco Rubio must have meant when he said save lives, they didn't include many of the child survival programs. The only thing those guys would accept were infectious disease programs. And even then, if you were going to die 31 days from now, they only covered things. If you can prove that somebody might die within the next month, okay, we'll keep it alive. But if it's going to happen later, like you cannot order medicine that's going to come in on day 45. That's too long out. So we're going to stop all those orders. You can order medicine if it'll save a life in the next month.
Wow.
But then they had this discussion, and it's well described in the book I mentioned, Into the Wood Chipper. It's worth a look because
Yeah.
it's just outrageous what they did.
Yeah, so like, I guess the question becomes like why we heard the reasons that the administration said that they dismantled it, right? Crooks, and you kind of mentioned about being crooks. It doesn't sound like a Beverly Hills corporate attorney making probably very good money is going to go work for the government to steal money. That doesn't make much sense to me, right? Like
No.
that doesn't really make logic in my head. And you're the first person from USAID I've ever spoken to. I have spoken with many different government employees, and generally it's not. Usually it's done for some type of higher meaning, higher purpose. It's definitely not for the pay, even though you said, obviously the dollar goes a lot further in a place like that. But why do you think that it really was shut down?
I think it was a political stunt. I think it was popular with Trump's base. I know that the American public always overestimated the portion of our budget that went toward foreign assistance because we did surveys routinely, and typically they'd come back. Most people will think might be 20% of our budget and whatnot. In fact, it was like less than 1%. And I'll give you one vignette that I mentioned in the book. There was in 1988, there was a B-1 bomber that went down in Texas, and there was another one that crashed in Montana. Each of those planes in 1988 dollars cost about $321 million to build. All of our assistance to sub-Saharan Africa, all 45 some countries there, did not add up to the cost of those two planes. And that's one example. Another thing that we accomplished was it was our scientists and working with universities and others that funded the work that provided the so-called Green Revolution back in the 1970s that drastically increased food productivity worldwide and has saved a lot of lives all by itself by preventing famines and such. There's a different book out there called The Enduring Struggle, a guy named Jim Norris, and he cites authorities that have studied this and said every 2 weeks now, the U.S. economy earns back the entire sum that we spent on our research for the Green Revolution in the form of profits on fertilizer and seeds and other, materials, that agricultural supplies that we are furnishing. But the agency did so much more that people don't know a thing about. We invented and created entire industries. I tell one example. We brought in a contractor to teach some farmers up in the mountains of Honduras to grow some onions. They shipped one container over to Miami to see if they could market those onions. They didn't look exactly like Walla Walla onions, and they came at a time when we didn't have the harvests weren't happening here. And 10 years later, 500,000 people are making their living growing those onions in Honduras.
Wow.
And then we did that with snow peas in Guatemala. We did it with strawberries in Guatemala. I used to actually translate to order the seedlings from a farm in California for the strawberries in Guatemala. We did it with broccoli. We did it with melons, with cantaloupes, with shrimp
Wow.
farms throughout the Gulf of Fonseca in Nicaragua and El Salvador. We did it with flowers in Costa Rica. We did it with flowers in Colombia. Uh, and I could go on and on. The types of projects we worked on just spanned the whole gamut of human activity. Uh, and quite often it was directly because we were concerned about some issue that was going to affect us. And so whatever we did to improve those economies in Central America, that stops the whole pressure to migrate north, and it helps us.
Yeah, so let me actually dig into that for a second, because you said I don't want to phrase it wrong, that only a very small percentage of the funding actually went to foreign aid, right? And that's what you said.
That's right.
Okay.
Small percentage of our budgets.
So when you say foreign aid, what do you mean, right? Because you're saying, okay, a small percentage went to foreign aid, and then the rest, we have these whole programs that we're going to build, different, to help build larger agricultural sectors for certain, products in Guatemala or wherever. How do you differentiate between foreign aid and foreign programs, I guess is the question.
I'm not distinguishing. What we
Okay.
were spending on these programs is what I'm calling foreign aid.
These are the foreign aid programs.
Yeah, all of it's foreign
gotcha.
aid.
Okay.
And I am including in that 1% not just the USAID budget, but also the support that we gave to some international organizations like the World Food Program, like the UN, and like the International Monetary Fund. And there's a whole gamut of people or organizations that benefit from the portion of our budget that goes to so-called foreign aid. But USAID was a very small part of our national budget, and foreign aid itself is a small part of that.
So so you're saying 1% of the USAID budget went to foreign aid, or of the U.S. national
1% of the entire budget of the United States government.
Okay,
it's less than 1%.
So that's very interesting, because you said these are all things that were like helping domestic interests, right? Like the things that you're naming about bringing strawberries or onions or cauliflower, like all these different products. Would you say that was like kind of the main point of USAID was kind of well, I mean, I would say that it was probably soft power, and maybe you can correct me there. But do you think it was also to kind of help us domestically, right? Because we see that a lot in other with other countries. I mean, even though very controversial, we've heard talked about that with like places like Greenland, right? Going and getting minerals. Is that a lot of what USAID did also?
We didn't get involved in the mining sector to any great extent, as far as I know. But what we were doing, it varied over the years. When it was first created in 1961, John Kennedy wanted one agency which would be the home for all of the various efforts we had overseas. I mean, there had been some foreign aid itself is historically a fairly new phenomenon in the world's history. You won't find before the 20th century a lot of examples where countries would take any part of their budget just to help some people in another country. There are a few examples. The biggest one was, and it predated USAID, was the Marshall Plan when we helped rebuild Europe after World War II. And then when we occupied Japan, we delivered a lot of assistance there, and we helped rebuild their economy and infrastructure that had been destroyed and whatnot. And the whole world is safer and richer because of what we did both in Europe and Japan.
Yeah.
In the 60s, the issue was, how are we going to compete against communism? Because they're offering a lot of goodies to the countries in Africa and Latin America, and we need some way to compete with them, and maybe USAID can do that. Later on, there was a major concern about population growth, and so USAID was asked to get involved in family planning programs and distributing condoms and other birth control equipment and whatnot. And then that led to some controversy. Would you ever fund anybody who even suggested an abortion or not? And we were told, no, you can't touch that subject. Get away from it. And if some organization is advocating abortions, then you're not going to help them. That's another topic. Later on, it became the food program. I mentioned the Green Revolution. When the Soviet Union broke apart, then they needed some agency somewhere to go out there and teach people how to have a capital market set up so that they can deal with the private sector, teach accountants and lawyers, what financial statements are about and how to regulate a capital market. So that was our job. We had to bring in these experts to almost everything I worked on. There were massive programs to teach government administrators or private sector participants how to do different things and do it better. And it was always negotiated with the host government, and both governments would decide, yeah, this is a win-win for both of us if we can make
Hmm.
this work. But you name it, when the environmentalists were concerned about biodiversity in Central America, they wanted a system of contiguous national parks. Well, we got that job. We had to convene meetings where the governments would talk to each other, and we brought in speakers to persuade them why this would make sense and what could be done about it. Or we would bring in groups that would train communities to do ecotourism to help preserve the forests. We would bring in groups to train game wardens as to how to better monitor for and combat poaching in the game parks somewhere. There were always different issues that became in vogue. It was like the crisis du jour, or of the year anyway, and they would ask us to get involved with it. So it varied over time, but as I said, we were the tool, the mechanism that the U.S. government could use to accomplish anything that wasn't appropriate for a military response, or something that could be even solved or dealt with just diplomacy. So the topics, and that's why I called the first book Dilettante, because I was working in so many different areas while simultaneously, dispensing legal advice about our foreign aid law, which
That's such a broad list of topics. Like you went
right,
all the way from teaching like accountants,
right,
capitalism in the Soviet Union to combating, poaching in South. That's such a and I think that people don't really think. I think people heard, on the news heard a lot about, like you mentioned, sexual health stuff, condoms and birth control and all that sort of stuff, which does have its purpose, with stopping the spread of disease and in places where disease are rampant, which can come back to the United States. But I don't think people realize, and I'm telling you right now, I didn't realize how broad that spectrum went, just as kind of almost like just a tool of soft power, a tool of foreign aid, or not foreign aid, foreign influence, almost like, all the way across the board. That's pretty wild. So, but now that it's gone, how, like, who fills that gap? Like, I mean, because these are things that are very much needed. Like the things that you're describing are very, very much needed for the United States to keep operating in the way that it does, and to have the influence the way it does globally. So, who does this now?
Other donors are picking up some of the slack. The whole impulse to assist people in other countries has not disappeared from the face of the earth. It's disappeared from our own government in large part, but other donors are picking up some of the slack. Some of the private organizations, like, many of the NGOs that were in the past quite dependent upon USAID, but they had some other sources of funding too from private donors and whatnot, like Mercy Corps, like CARE, like the Red Cross. They're out there, and and churches are doing their thing, and so the assistance has been scaled back dramatically, and you're right that our influence has been scaled back dramatically. I can only hope that at some point we realize the error of our actions, and that we try to reinstate, if not USAID, then something that looks like it. But in the meantime, we are without that tool. It's not there for us anymore. We're having to scramble right now, for instance, the Ebola epidemic that's happening in the DRC. Well, when USAID existed, we had a mission there. We would have already been on the scene with health people, within days of learning about it. But now the CDC is going to have to find people to go out there, and they have to make their own way there. They don't know the local systems and the local suppliers and whatnot. And that was one of the tragedies that is written about in that book, Into the Wood Chipper. There was an Ebola epidemic that broke out the week following the inauguration of Trump.
Wow.
And it was the same week they had issued a stop order to all of the contractors. And we had supplies in a warehouse in Kenya. The epidemic broke out in Kampala, which is only a couple-hour drive west from Nairobi. We had supplies we had already purchased, and they were sitting in a warehouse in Nairobi. And the Doge people would not allow any expense to be incurred so that those supplies could be transported to Kampala. And what they were these protection suits that, the people have to wear when they're burying a body that's been infected with Ebola. And you need that equipment in order to deal with the epidemic. And the same guys that were saying we're trying to save lives and whatnot were denying the access to that same equipment we had already bought. So um, another area I'll mention is that I didn't put it in my list before, but was the whole movement toward exporting democracy. USAID that became popular during Bill Clinton's era, and Al Gore promoted it. So then we got the job of, for instance, training judges and attorneys in Latin America to do jury trials. They wanted to move away from the Napoleonic justice system, and that became a big part of our work. And also elections assistance. We would fund observers like the Carter organization and others to come to town, and if the host government wanted to help, and that's a big caveat because sometimes they didn't appreciate it, but if they wanted it, we were willing to help with elections. We would help with their legislative staff efforts to get a functioning staff for their parliaments and whatnot. It just goes on and on.
Two separate things in there. One, that thing about the Ebola is absolutely tragic and so sad to hear. I can't imagine how many people, suffered so unnecessarily because we weren't able to get that stuff there. And seeing, lots of interviews had come out, since then about from some of those Doge. They look like children to me. I don't know. They young men that had no idea what they were talking about. That were just punching things into an AI. Didn't even have a clue what kind of actual real world effects these are happening on real people. And it's just so tragic to hear from the ground how unnecessary it really was. I mean, the stuff was already there. It had already been spent. Like there was no reason not to bring the stuff where it needed to be. And so many people were hurt by that. And you said hopefully one day we can get back and we can get another program like USAID, if not USAID. But this seems like it was something that took decades and decades and decades and decades to form, right? To be in the spot, to be working with the communities or working with the governments, and just like you said, like with the Ebola thing, already there. Like it wasn't you didn't have to travel or learn the customs. You were already there. You were already embedded. And it feels like even if that was restarted tomorrow, like we're going to be decades down the road until we get back to that spot. What kind of long-term ramifications are we actually dealing with here?
We're going to have a loss of influence for this and many other reasons, but we simply won't be as capable of implementing programs that would normally be pursued in our own self-interest. I mean, this was more than just generosity. This was very often it was tied with self-interest, and we simply won't have that capability. And you're right, it will take decades to reestablish the kind of capability. One of the crazy things they did was we had 60 years worth of evaluations and data. It was all online, but I know that university researchers and other people were accessing this all the time. It was called the Center for Development Information and Evaluation. We just called it by the acronym, the CDIE. Well, that whole webpage went blank, and I don't know where that data is. I hope they can turn it on again. But all of the studies that we had collected, because every project we had, that's another thing I wanted people to understand. USAID didn't cook up its own projects. Everything we did was vetted with the White House, with the Congress, with the committees. It was vetted with the State Department, with the Office of Management of Budget. They knew what we were doing well before we even started things. Quite often they were telling us in advance what to do. So we didn't cook up these programs. We implemented what they asked us to do and what the law asked us to do. And certainly there were times when we would make suggestions, but there was a big rain dance, always. I call it the aid rain dance, where you get all these documents together to describe what it is you want to do, describe how you're going to evaluate it, describe how you're going to monitor it and how you're going to audit it. And these programs were heavily audited. There were a lot of eyeballs all the time on everything we did. We had the General Accounting Office, we had our Inspector Generals, we had our own controllers in every mission. We had an auditing group, a controller staff and whatnot. So the idea that these things were we were off on a lark and a banner on our own was nuts. This stuff was discussed at the highest levels of the executive branch and with the Congress, and it was carefully watched all the time.
Yeah, and when again, when Doge came in and started, oh, they're doing all this, doing all of that. I never understood why people even really fell for that, right? Because that's not the way that money works in our government, right?
Well,
We
that's
don't
right.
like we have a constitution of the United States. Money is approved by Congress, right? We have the Congress has a purse. You don't have these little independent agencies within the government that can just decide where tax dollars are being spent. And I always used to make the comparison like if I went out and bought a new motorcycle and didn't tell my wife and slid my Visa, would my wife be mad at at Visa or at me for using the Visa? And I always said USAID is like the Visa. They were the way that money was spent. They were the mechanism in which those projects that were already approved were done. And maybe that's a little bit of a bad comparison. I thought I got the point across, but yeah, exactly. You guys were just implementing, and I think that's shown so much by the diversity of programs that you're talking about, right? Like
Yeah.
when you said like spreading democracy, spreading capitalism,
Right.
spreading environmental concerns, that it's constantly changing. Like this administration comes in, or the shift in the American psyche changes by decade to this and that, and you guys are just executing based off of that, like, and I think that's one thing that I think Americans didn't understand, because I don't think the majority of Americans had even heard of USAID prior to Doge going in and dismantling it. Like it was like people were trying to learn what it was and then why they were mad at it all at the exact same time,
That's
when
right.
it really wasn't affecting them at all. So what can you give me one more thing that people just didn't understand about USAID, right? Because I think we may have covered many already, but if you
Yeah,
have one more,
there's another one that and it might explain why. And I'm just speculating, but Elon Musk grew up in South Africa. He was a young white South African. At the same time, we were very instrumental in supporting the anti-apartheid groups. We had all kinds of programs to support these NGOs and these human rights defenders to get people out of jail when they were fighting against the apartheid system in South Africa. I was a legal advisor in Nairobi. My job was regional, and I had to travel around that region at the time. And I remember going through South Africa a couple times on my way in and out. I didn't work on the program there, but a lot of my colleagues did work on those programs, and I traveled there. I talked to a lot of people there. That program was successful. I know the man who was the mission director in South Africa who met Nelson Mandela when he got out of jail. So perhaps Musk had a bone to pick with USAID for the fact that we were supporting the anti-apartheid movement. I don't know. I'm speculating, but the list of the kinds of things we worked on. I give a long list, a partial list in my book, but I can't begin to describe the different areas that we worked in. And many times it was, principally aimed at poverty, and it was alleviating the impacts of poverty. We were also a mechanism to facilitate the food deliveries. We had there's a big program in the U.S. that buys surplus food from farmers, and this is built into our Constitution that all the farm states have 2 senators, so there's a lot of money that goes toward American farmers. That's not part of the USAID budget, but our people are in the countries where we send that food. So quite often, we had a large group that was simply working on distributing it and make sure that it wasn't wasted, and make sure that we had proper distribution mechanisms set up and proper ways to monitor it so that it wasn't just going to get stolen and sold on the open market. So that was a big part of what we did, was to help distribute the food. And it wasn't just for the U.S. budget. We did it for the World Food Program. I know I was in Guinea when the rice prices shot through the roof in 2007, and there was a big concern about getting appropriate food into West Africa. So I had to receive some of these shipments that came on ships. I didn't even ask if this stuff come from the U.S. or not. It was on a World Food Program boat, and I had to follow it up country and take part in some of the ceremonies where we delivered this food to these villages. And boy, they were very grateful to receive it. I will say that some of the stories in my book relate to the fragility of the social consensus. I was the acting DCM in Kyrgyzstan when the whole place fell apart. The Tulip Revolution happened, and the guy that was the real DCM had gone on home leave, so the ambassador asked me to be his deputy for that week. And and a couple of crowds got in front of the presidential palace, and they realized the guards didn't have any ammunition, so they scared the president away from the country. It's never been the same. I was in Guinea when Lassana Conte died. He had been their dictator for 20 years, and the whole place fell apart. The army started fighting itself. And then I was in Guatemala when the president tried to arrest the Congress and the Supreme Court. That didn't last. Anyway, I tell these stories, and part of my message is that I think even here, the social consensus is a lot more fragile than people realize. And that's something that I dwell on at some length in the book. I think that we are at risk to the degree that we stop trusting ourselves. I think we take for granted the stability of our own country. And that's an issue I think people should focus on more. But in terms of where they can find my book, there's another Clifford Brown that's way more famous than me, but he was a black jazz trumpet player in the 1950s. And so if you Google Clifford Brown, you're going to be looking at a different guy. So my website is Clifford H. Brown. H stands for Harris, cliffordhbrown.com, and there are links to my Substack and to the books there, and people can find me there.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again so much for coming in again on your birthday. Everybody go ahead and check out Clifford's book, Inside USAID, an Odyssey of Foreign Assistance. Would love to have you back on the show another time. Thank you so much for being here, and I really appreciate you, all right?
You bet. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Polypolitics podcast on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.